Okay, so today we're going to read chapter 13. As you remember at the end of chapter 12, Jonas was learning about colors, and the last memory that the giver transmitted to him was the one of the rainbow. So he's starting to understand colors a little bit better. We're going to see that in chapter 13 now. Just a little side note, I am recording in my kitchen with my 4 cats, so if you hear meows, I apologize, but it's nothing I can do about it. So here we go. Okay, chapter 13. Days went by and weeks. Jonas learned through the memories the names of colors and how now he began to see them all in his ordinary life, though he knew it was ordinary no longer and would never be again. But they didn't last. There would be a glimpse of green, the landscape lawns around the central plaza, a bush on the riverbank, the bright orange of pumpkins being tucked in from the agricultural fields beyond the community boundaries, seen in an instant, the flash of brilliant color, but gone again, returning to their flat and hueless shade. The giver told him that it would be a very long time before he had the colors to keep. But I want them, Jonas said angrily. It isn't fair that nothing has color. Not fair? The giver looked at Jonas curiously. Explain what you mean. Well, Jonas had to stop and think it through. If everything's the same, then there aren't any choices. I want to wake up in the morning and decide things, a blue tunic or a red one. He looked down at himself at the colorless fabric of his clothing. But it's all the same always. Then he laughed a little. I know it's not important what you wear. It doesn't matter, but it's the choosing that's important, isn't it? The giver asked him. Jonas nodded. My little brother, he began, and then corrected himself. No, that's inaccurate. He's not my brother, not really. But this new child that my family takes care of. His name's Gabriel. Yes, I know about Gabriel. Well, he's right at the age where he's learning so much. He grabs toys when we hold them in front of him. My father says he's learning small muscle control, and he's really cute. The giver nodded. But now that I can see colors at least sometimes, I was thinking, what if we could hold up things that were bright red or bright yellow, and then he could choose instead of the sameness. He might make the wrong choices. Oh, Jonas was silent for a minute. Oh, I see what you mean. It wouldn't be a matter for the new child's toy, but later it does matter, doesn't it? We don't dare to let people make choices of their own. Not safe, the giver suggested. Definitely not safe. Jonas said with certainty. What if they were allowed to choose their own mate and choose wrong? Or what if, he went on, almost laughing at the absurdity, they choose their own jobs? Frightening, isn't it? The giver said. Jonas chuckled. Very frightening. I can't even imagine it. We really have to protect people from the wrong choices. It's safer. Yes, Jonas agreed. Much safer. But when the conversation turned to other things, Jonas was left still with a feeling of frustration that he didn't understand. He found that he was often angry now, irrationally angry at his groupmates, that they were satisfied with their lives, which had none of the vibrance his own was taking on. And he was angry at himself that he could not change that for them. He tried, without asking permission from the giver, because he feared or knew that it would be denied. He tried to give his new awareness to his friends. Asher, Jonas said one morning, look at those flowers very carefully. They were standing beside a bed of geraniums planted near the hall of the open records. He put his hands on Asher's shoulder and concentrated on the red of the petals, trying to hold it as long as he could, and trying at the same time to transmit the awareness of red to his friend. What's the matter? Asher said uneasily. Is something wrong? He moved away from Jonas's hands. It was extremely rude for one citizen to touch another outside of family units. No, nothing. I thought for a minute that they were wilting, and we should let the gardening crew know they needed more watering. Jonas sighed and turned away. One evening he came home from his training, weighted with new knowledge. The giver had chosen a startling and disturbing memory that day. Under the touch of his hands, Jonas had found himself suddenly in a place that was completely alien, hot and windswept under a vast blue sky. There were tufts of sparse grass, few bushes and rocks, and nearby he could see an area of thicker vegetation, broad, low trees outlined against the sky. He could hear noises, the sharp crack of weapons. He perceived the word guns, and then shouts, and an immense crashing thud, and something fell, tearing branches from the trees. He heard voices calling to one another, peering from the place where he stood hidden behind some shrubbery. He was reminded of what the giver had told him, that there had been a time when flesh had different colors. 2 of the men had dark brown skin, the others were light. Going closer, he watched them hack the husks from motionless elephant on the ground and haul them away, spattered with blood. He felt himself overwhelmed with a new perception of the color he knew as red. Then the men were gone, speeding towards the horizon in a vehicle that spit pebbles from its whirling tires. One hit his forehead and stung him there. But the memory continued, though Jonas ached now for it to end. Now he saw another elephant emerge from the place where it had stood hidden in the trees, and very slowly it walked to the mutilated body and looked down. With its sinuous trunk it stroked the huge corpse. Then it reached up, broke some leafy branches with a snap, and draped them over the mass of torn thick flesh. Finally it tilted its massive head and raised its trunk and roared into the empty landscape. Jonas had never heard such a sound. It was a sound of rage and grief, and it seemed never to end. He could still hear it when he opened his eyes and lay anguished on the bed where he received the memories. It continued to roar into his consciousness as he pedaled slowly home. "Lily," he asked that evening when his sister took her comfort object, the stuffed elephant, from the shelf, "did you know that once there were really elephants, live ones?" She glanced down at the ragged comfort object and grinned. "Right," she said skeptically. "Sure, Jonas." Jonas went and sat beside them while his father untied Lily's hair ribbons and combed their hair. He placed one hand on each of their shoulders, and with all of his being he tried to give each of them a piece of the memory, not of the tortured cry of the elephant, but of the being of the elephant, of the towering immense creature and the meticulous touch with which it had tended its friend at the end. But his father had continued to comb Lily's long hair, and Lily, impatient, had finally wriggled under her brother's touch. "Jonas, you're hurting me with your hand." "I apologize for hurting you, Lily," Jonas mumbled, and took his hand away. "Accept your apology," Lily responded indifferently, stroking the lifeless elephant. "Giver," Jonas asked once, as they prepared for the day's work, "don't you have a spouse? Aren't you allowed to apply for one?" Although he was exempted from the rules against rudeness, he was aware that his question was rude. But the giver had encouraged all of his questions, not seeming to be embarrassed or offended by even the most personal. The giver chuckled. "No, there's no rule against it, and I did have a spouse. You're forgetting how old I am, Jonas. My former spouse lives now with the childless adults." Oh, of course, Jonas had forgotten the giver's obvious age. When adults of the community became older, their lives became different. They were no longer needed to create family units. Jonas's own parents, when he and Lily were grown, would go live with the childless adults. "You'll be able to apply for a spouse, Jonas, if you want to. I'll warn you, though, that it will be difficult. Your living arrangements will have to be different from those of most family units because the books are forbidden to citizens. You and I are the only ones with access to the books." Jonas glanced around at the astonishing array of volumes. From time to time now he could see their colors, with their hours together, his and the giver's consumed by conversation and by transmissions of memories. Jonas had not yet opened any of the books, but he read the titles here and there and knew that they contained all of the knowledge of centuries and that one day they would belong to him. "So, if I have a spouse, and maybe children, I will have to hide the books from them." The giver nodded. "I wasn't permitted to share the books with my spouse. That's correct. And there are other difficulties too. You remember the rule that says the new receiver can't talk about his training?" Jonas nodded. Of course he remembered. It had turned out by far to be the most frustrating of the rules he was required to obey. "Well, when you become the official receiver, when you're finished here, you'll be given a whole new set of rules, and those are the rules that I obey. And it won't surprise you that I'm forbidden to talk about my work to anyone except the new receiver, and that's you, of course. So there will be a whole part of your life which you won't be able to share with family. It's hard, Jonas. It was hard for me." "You do understand, don't you, that this is my life, the memories?" Jonas nodded, but he was puzzled. Didn't life consist of the things you did each day? There wasn't anything else, really. "I've seen you taking walks," he said. The giver sighed. "I walk, I eat at mealtimes, and then when I'm called by the committee of elders, I appear before them to give them counsel and advice." "Do you advise them often?" Jonas was a little frightened at the thought that one day he would be the one to advise the ruling body. But the giver said no, rarely, only when they're faced with something that they have not experienced before. Then they call upon me to use the memories and advise them. But it is very seldom. Sometimes I wish they'd ask for my wisdom more often. There are so many things I could tell them, things that I would change, but they don't want change. Life here is so orderly, so predictable, so painless. It's what they've chosen. "I don't know why they even need a receiver then if they never call upon him," Jonas commented. "They need me and you," the giver said, but didn't explain. They were reminded of that 10 years ago. "What happened 10 years ago?" Jonas asked. "Oh, I know. You tried to train a successor and it failed. Why? Why did that remind them?" The giver smiled grimly. When the new receiver failed, the memories that she had received were released. They didn't come back to me. They went... He paused and seemed to be struggling with the concept. I don't know exactly. They went to the place where memories once existed before receivers were created. Some place out there, he gestured vaguely with his arm. And then the people had access to them. And apparently that's the way it was once. Everyone had access to memories. It was chaos, he said. They really suffered for a while. And finally it subsided and the memories were assimilated. But it certainly made them aware of how they need a receiver to contain all that pain and knowledge. But you have to suffer like that all the time, Jonas pointed out. The giver nodded. And you will. It's my life, and it will be yours. Jonas thought about it, about what it would be like for him. Along with walking and eating, he looked around the walls of the books. Reading? That's it? The giver shook his head. Those are the simple things that I do. My life is here. In this room? The giver shook his head. He put his hands to his own face to his chest. No, here, in my being, where the memories are. My instructors in science and technology have taught us about how the brain works. It's full of electronical pulses. It's like a computer. If you stimulate one part of the brain with an electrode, it... He stopped talking. He could see the odd look on the giver's face. They know nothing, the giver said bitterly. Jonas was shocked. Since the first day in the annex room, they had together disregarded the rules about rudeness, and Jonas felt comfortable with that now. But this was different and far beyond rude. This was a terrible accusation. What if someone had heard? He glanced quickly at the wall speaker, terrified that the committee might be listening, and they would at any time. But as always during their sessions together, the switch had been turned to off. Nothing. Jonas whispered nervously, but my instructors. The giver flicked his hands as if brushing something aside. Oh, your instructors are well trained. They know their scientific facts. Everyone is well trained for his job. It's just that, without the memories, it's all meaningless. They gave that burden to me and to the previous receiver and the one before him, and back and back and back, Jonas said, knowing the phrase that always came. The giver smiled, though his smile was oddly harsh. That's right. And next it will be you. A great honor. Yes, sir. They told me that at the ceremony. The very highest honor. Some afternoons, the giver sent him away without training. Jonas knew on days when he arrived to find the giver hunched over, rocking in his body slightly back and forth, his face pale, that he would be sent away. Go, the giver would say to him tensely. I'm in pain today. Come back tomorrow. On those days, worried and disappointed, Jonas would walk alone beside the river. The paths were empty of people except for the few delivery crews and landscape workers here and there. Small children were all at the childcare center after school, and the older ones were busy with volunteer hours or training. By himself, he tested his own developing memory. He watched the landscape for glimpses of the greens that he knew were embedded in the shrubbery. And when it came flickering into his consciousness, he focused upon it, keeping it there, darkening it, holding it in his vision as long as possible until his head hurt as he let it fade away. He stared at the flat, colorless sky, bringing blue from it, and remembered sunshine until finally, for an instant, he could feel warmth. He stood at the foot of the bridge that spanned the river, the bridge that citizens were allowed to cross only on official business. Jonas had crossed it on school trips visiting outlying communities. He knew that land beyond the bridge was much the same, flat and well-ordered, with fields for agriculture. The other communities he had seen on visits were essentially the same as his own. The only difference were slightly altered styles of dwellings, slightly different schedules in school. He wondered what lay in the far distance where he had never gone. The land didn't end beyond those nearby communities, were the hills elsewhere, where the vast wind-torn areas like the place he had seen in his memory, the place where the elephant died. Giver, he asked one afternoon following a day when he had been sent away, what causes you pain? When the giver was silent, Jonas continued. The chief elder told me at the beginning that the receiving of memories causes terrible pain, and you described for me that the failure of the last receiver released painful memories to the community. But I haven't suffered, Giver, not really, Jonas smiled. I remember the sunburn you gave me the very first day, but that wasn't so terrible. What is it that makes you suffer so much? If you gave me some of it, maybe your pain would be less. The giver nodded. Lie down, he said. It's time, I suppose. I can't shield you forever. You're going to have to take it all in eventually. Let me think, he went on, when Jonas was on the bed waiting a little fearful. All right, the giver said after a moment. I've decided. We'll start with something familiar. Let's go once again to a hill and a sled. And he placed his hands on Jonas's back. And that's the end of chapter 13. Let's look at the summary together now. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 13. So a few things happened in that chapter that we can review. So if you look at the slide on chapter 13 summary. So as the weeks go by, Jonas learns all the colors and he still sees only glimpses of them in the world around him. The giver explains to him that it's going to take time for him to be able to hold on to those. Jonas is angry that the world is devoid of color. It's just not fair, he says. And Jonas realizes the wisdom. He agrees that people shouldn't be allowed to choose their own spouses or jobs because they might make the wrong choice. And they have to protect the people from the wrong choices because that way it's safer. He actually feels angry all the time. He's angry at his friends, for example, for not being satisfied with their lives, which are so dull and not vibrant. Then one day the giver transmits to Jonas the memory of poachers killing an elephant. The dead elephant's mate finds it after the poachers hack off its tusks, which is sad. And he watches how the interaction of the elephants occurs. And that's one of the first memories that is a little bit painful in a sense of emotional pain, not physical pain. The subject of failure from 10 years ago comes up again, and Jonas asks what happened. The giver explains that when she, the last receiver of memory, failed, that the memories didn't come back to him. Instead, they were released to the world. Everyone had access to them the way it used to be. And that was quite difficult for the people in the community to deal with because they'd never experienced any of these emotions. So it came flooding back to them, and they just didn't know how to react. So it was a very, very difficult time for them. One day, Jonas asks the giver what causes him so much pain. Jonas asks if perhaps it isn't about time for him to take some of the painful memories to carry himself. And the giver agrees. And that's where we end the chapter. So he does talk about how he's going to go back to the moment where he's with the sled and the snow, which is a familiar moment, but he's going to have to experience physical pain now. So we'll see in chapter 14 what that pain involves. Okay, so now we're going to read chapter 14. If you remember at the end of chapter 13, the giver was going to transmit a memory of pain to Jonas. We didn't know what it was, but we know it was going to involve the snow and a sled. So let's read chapter 14 to find out what happens. Here we go. Chapter 14. It was much the same, this memory, though the hill seemed to be a different one, steeper, and the snow was not falling as thickly as it had before. It was colder also, Jonas perceived. He could see, as he sat waiting at the top of the hill, that the snow beneath the sled was not thick and soft as it had been before, but hard and coated with bluish ice. The sled moved forward, and Jonas grinned with delight, looking forward at the breathtaking slide down through the invigorating air. But the runners this time couldn't slice through the frozen expanse as they had on the other snow-cushioned hill. They skittered sideways, and the sled gathered speed, and Jonas pulled at the ropes trying to steer, but the steepness and speed took control from his hands, and he was no longer enjoying the feeling of freedom, but instead, terrified, was at the mercy of the wild acceleration downward over the ice. Sideways, spinning, the sled hit a bump in the hill, and Jonas was jarred loose and thrown violently into the air. He fell with his leg twisted under him and could hear the crack of the bone. His face scraped along jagged edges of ice, and when he came at last to a stop, he lay shocked and still, feeling nothing at first but fear. Then the first wave of pain. He gasped. It was as if a hatchet lay lodged in his leg, slicing through each nerve with a hot blade. In his agony, he perceived the word fire and felt flames licking at the torn bone and flesh. He tried to move and could not. The pain grew. He screamed. There was no answer. Sobbing, he turned his head and vomited onto the frozen snow. Blood dripped from his face into the vomit. "No!" he cried, and the sound disappeared into the empty landscape, into the wind. Then suddenly he was in the annex room again, writhing on the bed. His face was wet with tears. Able to move now, he rocked his own body back and forth, breathing deeply to release the remembered pain. He sat and looked at his own leg where it lay straight on the bed, unbroken. The brutal slice of pain was gone, but the leg ached horribly, still, and his face felt raw. "May I have relief of pain, please?" he begged. It was always provided in the everyday life for bruises and wounds, for mashed fingers, a stomach ache, a skinned knee from a fall from a bike. There was always a dab of anesthetic ointment or a pill, or in severe instances, an injection that brought complete and instantaneous deliverance. But the giver said no and looked away. Limping, Jonas walked home, pushing his bicycle that evening. The sunburn pain had been so small in comparison and had not stayed with him, but this ache lingered. It was not unendurable, as the pain on the hill had been. Jonas tried to be brave. He remembered that the chief elder had said he was brave. "Is something wrong, Jonas?" his father asked at the evening meal. "You're so quiet tonight. Aren't you feeling well? Would you like some medication?" But Jonas remembered the rules. No medication for anything related to his training. and no discussion of his training. At the time for sharing of feelings, he simply said that he felt tired, that his school lesson had been unusually demanding that day. He went to his sleeping room early, and from behind the closed door he could hear his parents and sister laughing as they gave Gabriel his evening bath. They had never known pain, he thought. The realization made him feel desperately lonely, and he rubbed his throbbing leg. He eventually slept. Again and again he dreamed of the anguish and the isolation on the forsaken hill. The daily trainings continued, and now it was always including pain. The agony of the fractured leg began to seem more like a mild discomfort as the giver led Jonas firmly, little by little, into the deep and terrible suffering of the past. Each time, in his kindness, the giver ended the afternoon with a color-filled memory of pleasure, a brisk sail on a blue-green lake, a meadow dotted with yellow wildflowers, an orange sunset behind mountains. It was not enough to assuage the pain that Jonas was beginning now to know. Why? Jonas asked him after he had received a torturous memory in which he had been neglected and unfed. The hunger had caused excruciating spasms in his empty, distended stomach. He lay on the bed aching. Why do you and I have to hold these memories? It gives us wisdom, the giver replied. Without wisdom, I could not fulfill my function of advising the committee of elders when they call upon me. But what wisdom do you get from hunger? Jonas groaned. His stomach still hurt, though the memory had ended. Well, some years ago, the giver told him, before your birth, a lot of citizens petitioned the committee of elders. They wanted to increase the rate of births. They wanted each birth mother to be assigned 4 births instead of 3, so that the population would increase and there would be more laborers available. Jonas nodded, listening. Well, that makes sense. Well, the idea was certain family units could accommodate an additional child. Jonas nodded again. Mine could. We have Gabriel this year, and it's fun having a 3rd child. The committee of elders sought my advice, the giver said. It made sense to them, too. It was a new idea, and they came to me for wisdom. And you used your memories. The giver said yes, and the strongest memory that came was hunger. It came from many generations back, centuries back. The population had gotten so big that hunger was everywhere. Excruciating hunger and starvation. It was followed by warfare. Warfare? It was a concept Jonas did not know, but hunger was familiar to him now. Unconsciously, he rubbed his own abdomen, recalling the pain of its unfulfilled needs. So you describe that to them. Well, they don't want to hear about pain. They just seek the advice. I simply advise them against increasing the population. But you said that was before my birth. They hardly ever come to you for advice. Only when what is it you said? When they have a problem they've never faced before? When did that happen last? Do you remember the day when the plane flew over the community? Yes, I was scared. Well, so were they. They prepared to shoot it down, but they sought my advice. I told them to wait. But how did you know? How did you know the pilot was lost? I didn't. I used my wisdom from the memories. I knew that there had been times in the past, terrible times, when people had destroyed others in haste, in fear, and had brought about their own destruction. Jonas realized something. That means, he said slowly, that you have memories of destruction, and you have to give them to me too, because I have to get the wisdom. The giver nodded. But it'll hurt, Jonas said. It wasn't a question. It will hurt terribly, the giver agreed. But why can't everyone have the memories? I think it would be easier if the memories were shared. You and I wouldn't have to bear so much by ourselves if everyone took a part. The giver sighed. You're right, he said. But then everyone would be burdened and pained, and they don't want that. And that's the real reason the receiver is so vital to them and honored. They selected me and you to lift that burden from themselves. When did they decide that? It wasn't fair. Let's change it. How do you suggest we do that? I've never been able to think of a way, and I'm supposed to be the one with all the wisdom. But there are 2 of us now, Jonas said eagerly. Together, we can think of something. The giver watched him with a wry smile. Why can't we just apply for a change of rules, Jonas suggested. The giver laughed, and Jonas too chuckled reluctantly. This decision was made long before my time or yours, the giver said, and before the previous receiver, and he waited. Back and back and back, Jonas repeated the familiar phrase. Sometimes it had seemed humorous to him. Sometimes it seemed meaningful and important. Now it was ominous. It meant he knew that nothing would ever change. The new child, Gabriel, was growing and successfully passed the test of maturity that the nurturers gave each month. He could sit alone now, reach for and grasp small objects, and he had 6 teeth. During the daytime hours, Father reported he was cheerful and seemed of normal intelligence. But he remained fretful at night, whimpering often, needing frequent attention. "After all this extra time I put in with him," Father said one evening after Gabriel had been bathed and was lying for the moment hugging his hippo placidly in his small crib that had been replaced by the basket. "I hope they're not going to decide to release him." "Maybe it would be for the best," Mother suggested. "I know you don't mind getting up with him at night, but the lack of sleep is awfully hard for me." "If they release Gabriel, can we get another new child as a visitor?" asked Lily. She was kneeling beside the crib, making funny faces at the little one, who was smiling back at her. Jonas's mother rolled her eyes in dismay. "No," Father said, smiling. He ruffled Lily's hair. "It's very rare. Anyway, that a new child's status is uncertain as Gabriel's. It probably won't happen again for a long time." "Anyway," he sighed, "they won't make the decision for a while. Right now we're preparing for a release we'll probably have to make very soon. There's a birth mother who's expecting twin males next month." "Oh, dear," Mother said, shaking her head. "If they're identical, I hope you're not the one assigned." "I am. I'm the next one on the list. I'll have to select the one to be nurtured and the one to be released. It's usually not hard, though. Usually it's just a matter of birth weight. We release the smaller of the two." Jonas listened, though, suddenly about the bridge and how, standing there, he had wondered what lay elsewhere. Was there someone there waiting who would receive this tiny released twin? Would it grow up elsewhere, not knowing ever that in this community lived a being who looked exactly the same? For a moment he felt a tiny fluttering of hope that he knew was quite foolish. He hoped that it would be Larissa waiting, Larissa, the old woman he had bathed. He remembered her sparkling eyes, her soft voice, her low chuckle. Fiona had told him recently that Larissa had been released at a wonderful ceremony. But he knew that the old were not given children to raise. Larissa's life elsewhere would be quiet and serene, as befit the old. She would not welcome the responsibility of nurturing a new child who needed feeding and care, and would likely cry at night. "Mother, Father," he said, the idea coming to him unexpectedly, "why don't we put Gabriel's crib in my room tonight? I know how to feed and comfort him, and it would let you and Father get some sleep." Father looked doubtful. "You sleep so soundly, Jonas. What if the restlessness doesn't wake you?" It was Lily who answered that. "If no one goes to tend to Gabriel, he gets very loud. He'd wake us all up, even if Jonas slips through it." Father laughed. "You're right, Lily Billy. All right, Jonas, let's try it, just for tonight. I'll take the night off, and we'll let Mother get some sleep, too." Gabriel slept soundly for the earliest part of the night. Jonas in his bed lay awake for a while. From time to time he raised himself on one elbow, looking over the crib. The new child was on his stomach, his arms relaxed beside his head, his eyes closed, and his breathing regular and undisturbed. Finally, Jonas slept too. Then, at the middle hours of the night approached, the noise of Gabe's restlessness woke Jonas. The new child was turning under his covers, flaying his arms, and beginning to whimper. Jonas rose and went to him. Gently he patted Gabriel's back. Sometimes that was all it took to lull him back to sleep, but the new child still squirmed fretfully under his hand. Still patting rhythmically, Jonas began to remember the wonderful sail that the giver had given him not long before. A bright, breezy day on a clear turquoise lake, and above him the white sail of the boat billowing as he moved along it in the brisk wind. He was not aware of giving the memory, but suddenly he realized that it was becoming dimmer and that it was sliding through his hands into the being of the new child. Gabriel became quiet. Startled, Jonas pulled back from what was left of the memory with a burst of will. He removed his hand from the little back and stood quietly beside the crib. To himself, he called the memory of the sail forward again. It was still there, but the sky was less blue, the gentle motion of the boat slower, the water of the lake more murky and clouded. He kept it for a while, soothing his own nervousness as what had occurred, then let it go and returned to his bed. Once more, towards dawn, the new child woke and cried out again. And again Jonas went to him. This time he quite deliberately placed his hands firmly on Gabriel's back and released the rest of the calming day on the lake. Again Gabriel slept. But now Jonas lay awake thinking. He no longer had any more than a wisp of the memory, and he felt a small lack where it had been. He could ask the giver for another sail, he knew, a sail perhaps an ocean next time, for Jonas had a memory of ocean now, and knew what it was. He knew that there were sailboats there too, in memories yet to be acquired. He wondered, though, if he should confess to the giver that he had given a memory away. He was not yet qualified to be a giver himself, nor had Gabriel been selected to be a receiver, and that he had his power frightened him. He decided not to tell. That's the end of chapter 14. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 14. Let's have a look at a summary of chapter 14. We'll go through some of the points that are on the slide, okay? For this memory, the giver sends Jonas back to his spot on the hill with the sled, and this time the memory includes pain. He then asks the giver for pain medication, but the giver refuses and reminds him of his set of rules. So what he did is he transmitted a memory of a broken leg. So he was sliding down on an icy hill rather than a snowy hill, and then he crashed and he burnt his face on the ice and he broke his leg, and that was extremely painful. But he and at the end he did ask for pain medication, and the giver had to say no because he's not allowed to do that. Then the giver starts transmitting more and more painful memories to Jonas, though he always ends the day with a pleasant memory, like sailing on a blue lake during a sunset, things like that. So he always finishes with something good, so he walks away feeling good. And this he learned from the last receiver, when, remember, he talked about how he went too quickly with painful memories, and this time he's going to go slowly. He's going to give him the painful memories, but he's also going to sort of like buffer it a little bit with some good memories. After he receives the memory of starvation, Jonas asks the giver why it is that they need to preserve this kind of memory. It's a horrible memory. And so he explains that the memories provide the wisdom he needs to advise the elders, because years ago he said they wanted the birth mothers to have 4 children instead of 3, and that they wanted to increase the population, saying that some of the families could have more than 2 children, except that the giver used some of his memories to explain to the committee that large populations can lead to starvation and even warfare, because there's not enough food to go around. So he talked about that, and that's why it wasn't. Jonas doesn't really know what warfare is, so it's kind of hard for him to understand what that means. Meanwhile, little Gabriel is doing really well. He's growing and eating and healthy, although he needs some extra attention at night. Jonas's father hopes that they won't release him, given that he's put so much time into caring for this infant. So he's going to keep working with him. There's also a mention in the chapter, and it's not in the summary here, where one of the birth mothers actually has twins, and that's not allowed. You can't have 2 people who look the same in the community. So what they do is they decide which of the twins is lower in birth weight, and they'll release that particular twin to elsewhere. And Jonas is quite worried about that, but then he also wonders, is somebody going to be greeting this new baby when he leaves to elsewhere? When he gets there, will somebody be there to receive him? And he thinks about Larissa, the older woman that we learned in an earlier chapter. He thinks of her as a nurturing person and will love her to receive the baby, but he knows that wouldn't happen because they wouldn't ask old people to look after babies. But he does hope that somebody is there to welcome this baby into elsewhere. In the middle of the night, Gabriel's fussing wakes Jonas, and he pats the baby. And then while doing this, he starts to transmit a memory of the sailboat. He doesn't do it intentionally. It's kind of accidental at first, but then he realizes that it's actually working and that he's losing some of the memory. And so all of a sudden, Gabe is comforted and he stops fussing, and Jonas can feel that the memory is disappearing from his mind, and he pulls back. So this is quite an important part of the chapter here, because that Jonas has tried to do this previously. He tried it with Asher, he tried it with Lily and his father to transmit those memories, and it never worked. But this time it actually worked with Gabe. So we know that Gabe is different. He has the same color eyes as Jonas, and now he can receive memories. So it's really interesting that you might actually have these discussions in your class, and you might talk about some of the similarities between Jonas and Gabriel, and how that goes. And maybe they had the same birth mother. We don't know that, but that could be something that could come up in a discussion. So that's the end of chapter 14. Let's go to chapter 15 now. Okay, so we just finished chapter 14, and you saw that Gabriel was able to receive memories from Jonas, which was quite important. So remember to look through the summary, or listen to the summary part, and make sure you do read those chapters really carefully, especially if you're going to be having discussions in class, because it's really important to know all the details to be able to do that. So chapter 15 is a really short chapter, but it's a really powerful chapter, so you've got to listen to it carefully. The imagery that Lois Lowry uses in this chapter, and the descriptive words and the feelings that she passes along to the reader are really incredible. So we want to make sure that we read this carefully, because this is a really great point for discussion in class, and also really good if you're writing essays later on. Okay, here we go. Chapter 15. Jonas entered the annex room and realized immediately that it was a day when he would be sent away. The giver was rigid in his chair, his face in his hands. "I'll come back tomorrow, sir," he said quickly. Then he hesitated. "Unless maybe there's something I can do to help." The giver looked up at him, his face contorted with suffering. "Please," he gasped, "take some of the pain." Jonas helped him to his chair at the side of the bed. Then he quickly removed his tunic and lay face down. "Put your hands on me," he directed, aware that in such anguish the giver might need reminding. The hands came, and the pain came with them, and through them Jonas braced himself and entered the memory which was torturing the giver. He was in a confused, noisy, foul-smelling place. It was daylight, early morning, and the air was thick with smoke that hung, yellow and brown, above the ground. Around him, everywhere, far across the expanse of what seemed to be a field, lay groaning men. A wild-eyed horse, its bridle torn and dangling, trotted frantically through the mounds of men, tossing his head, whinnying in pain. It stumbled, finally, then fell, and did not rise. Jonas heard a voice next to him. "Water," the voice said in a parched, croaking whisper. He turned his head towards the voice and looked into the half-closed eyes of a boy who seemed not much older than himself. Dirt streaked the boy's face and his matted blonde hair. He lay sprawled, his gray uniform glistening with wet, fresh blood. The colors of the carnage were grotesquely bright, the crimson wetness on the rough and dusty fabric, the ripped shreds of grass startlingly green in the boy's yellow hair. The boy stared at him. "Water," he begged again. And when he spoke, a new spurt of blood drenched the coarse cloth across his chest and sleeve. One of Jonas's arms was immobilized with pain, and he could see through his own torn sleeve something that looked like ragged flesh and splintering bones. He tried his remaining arm and felt it move. Slowly he reached to the side and felt the metal container there, and removed its cap, stopping the small motion of his hand now and then to wait for the surging pain to ease. Finally, when the container was open, he extended his arm slowly across the blood-soaked earth, inch by inch, and held it to the lips of the boy. Water trickled into the imploring mouth and down the grimy chin. The boy sighed. His head fell back, his lower jaw dropping as if he had been surprised by something. A dull blankness slid across his eyes, and he was silent. But the noise continued all around, the cries of the wounded men, the cries begging for water and for mother and for death. Horses lying on the ground shrieked, raising their heads, and stabbed randomly towards the sky with their hooves. From the distance Jonas could hear the thud of cannons. Overwhelmed by pain, he lay there in the fearsome stench for hours, listening to the men and animals die, and learned what warfare meant. And finally, when he knew that he could no longer bear it, and could welcome death himself, he opened his eyes and was once again on the bed. The giver looked away, as if he could not bear to see what he had done to Jonas. "Forgive me," he said. That's the end of chapter 15. Very powerful chapter. Let's have a look at the summary of that one now. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 15, and as I said earlier, it's a very short chapter, but a very powerful chapter. It's that the memory of warfare that the giver is experiencing, and when Jonas walks in, it's really painful. So let's have a look at what the slide says. When Jonas shows up the giver's room, the old man is crumpled in pain, and Jonas readies to leave, but the giver begs him to take some of the pain, which he willingly does. And he even has to tell the giver, "Come and put your hands on me." He's in so much pain. This time, Jonas receives the memory of a body-strewn battlefield. He himself is lying on the ground and seems to be missing a good chunk of his arm, and he's forced to watch a comrade beside him slowly die. When he can't take it anymore, Jonas opens his eyes and returns to the room with the giver. The giver apologizes for having transmitted such an awful memory, and he looks away from Jonas. The thing that I want you to take away from this chapter is all the great imagery that Lois Lowry talks about. You can see she describes the colors. You can almost feel the pain that the soldiers are going through, the horses, the scene, the stench, the smell. It's actually talking about all the senses that in that very short chapter. So when you have a discussion in class, or if you want to talk about this in an essay or free write, you want to talk about the imagery that she uses and the descriptive language, and how you can almost feel the words coming out of the page and you can actually see them. So that's the end of chapter 15.